There is a version of the American dream that looks, from the outside, like everything a person could want. A colonial home on a quiet street in Connecticut. A husband who flies for one of the most recognizable airlines in the world. 3 children, a golden retriever. Neighbors who wave from driveways. Christmas cards sent every December. And then there is what happens behind closed doors. This is not a story about monsters who live at the margins. This is a story about a man who lived at the center of ordinary life, admired, trusted, unremarkable, and what he chose to do when that life stopped suiting him. It is also the story of a woman named Hella, a woman who came from another country, built a life in a place that was not her own, loved her children fiercely, and deserved far better than the ending she was given. Her name is Hella Crafts, and what happened to her, and how it was discovered, would rewrite the rules of forensic investigation forever. To understand this case, you have to understand who Hella was before she became a name in a true crime file. She was born Hella Lore Nielsen in Copenhagen, Denmark in 1947. By all accounts, she was a vibrant, determined young woman, the kind of person who did not simply drift through life, but moved through it with intention. She trained as a flight attendant, which in the 1960s and early 1970s was not the commonplace profession it would later become. It required poise, composure, the ability to manage chaos with a smile and make strangers feel safe at 30,000 feet. Hella had all of that. It was through aviation that she met Richard Crafts, an Eastern Airlines pilot, ex-Marine, and man of considerable charm. They married in 1975. They settled in Newtown, Connecticut. They had 3 children, Andrew, Thomas, and Lisa. On the surface, the marriage looked stable. Richard was reliable in the way that men of his generation often defined reliability. He worked, he provided, he showed up. But those who knew Hella well told a different story. She was lonely. Friends would later recall that Hella had confided in them for years about the emotional distance in the marriage. Richard was cold, they said, controlling in quiet ways, more interested in his extensive collection of weapons, his law enforcement side jobs, and his gadgets than in the woman who had given him a family. And yet, Hella stayed. For years, she stayed. Because she was practical, because she had children, because she was not yet ready to pull apart the life she had built, even if it no longer felt like hers. But by 1986, something had shifted. Hella had hired a private investigator. She had discovered that Richard was having an affair, one of several, friends would later allege, and quietly, carefully, she had begun speaking to a divorce attorney. She was 39 years old. She had a plan. She was moving towards something new. She never got there. What makes Hella's story so deeply human and so painful is not just what happened to her, but what she was in the process of choosing for herself. She was not a passive figure. She was someone in motion, someone who had decided that she deserved more. That decision, that courage, may have been what sealed her fate. November 18, 1986. Hella Crafts boards a flight from Frankfurt, Germany, back to the United States. She has been working her regular international route. She is tired. She is coming home. She lands. She drives back to Newtown. And then she is gone. Not immediately. Not in a way that anyone notices right away. That is one of the most chilling aspects of this case. Hella simply stops being seen. And the world keeps moving. Richard tells the children their mother is away, traveling, working. He brings in a nanny, a woman he had been involved with, to care for the kids. Neighbors note that life at the Crafts house looks normal, perhaps more organized than usual, but normal. It is Hella's friends who first feel the wrongness of it. Her closest friend, a woman named Karen Rogers, begins making calls. She cannot reach Hella. Richard's explanations keep shifting. She's in Europe. She's visiting family. She needed space. Each answer is slightly different from the last. Each answer is delivered with the practiced calm of a man who has thought about this. Karen Rogers goes to the police. Here is where we must pause and sit with something uncomfortable. When she first reports her concern, she is not taken seriously. Law enforcement at the time had no reason to suspect anything beyond a marital separation. Adults leave. Marriages end. Women sometimes need to disappear from difficult situations. The system, at this moment, fails Hella Crafts. But Karen Rogers does not give up. She pushes. She contacts a private investigator named Keith Mayo, and Mayo, methodically, begins to pull on threads. He finds financial records that show no activity on Helly's accounts after November 18th. No withdrawals, no purchases. A woman who was supposedly living her life was leaving no trace of it. He finds that Richard had rented a woodchipper, an industrial-grade machine, in the days following Helly's disappearance. And he finds that a neighbor had seen a truck near the banks of the Housatonic River in the early hours of a freezing November morning. The truck had been running, in the dark, in the cold. By January 1987, Connecticut State Police are involved, and what they find along the banks of the Housatonic River and in a nearby lake will change the course of forensic science in America. Investigators work through bone-numbing cold. They sift, they catalog. They find fragments, small, damp, scattered, that alone mean very little, but together begin to form a terrible picture. Among the evidence collected, a small scrap of fabric consistent with fabric found in the Crafts' home, a portion of a human tooth later identified as belonging to a European-born woman, a fingernail with blue polish, and beneath the frozen soil near the river's edge, a strand of blonde hair, Helly's hair. There is no body. There will never be a complete body. But there is enough. There is enough to name Richard Crafts as a suspect, enough to arrest him, and enough, for the first time in American legal history, to bring a murder prosecution without a corpse. What the investigators faced was, by any measure, an extraordinary challenge. Murder cases are built on evidence, on bodies, on cause of death, on physical proof that links a perpetrator to a victim at a specific moment in time. The prosecution of Richard Crafts would have almost none of the conventional building blocks. What it had instead was the painstaking, almost obsessive work of forensic specialists and the quiet determination of investigators who refused to accept that cleverness and cold could erase a person completely. Dr. Henry Lee, one of the most respected forensic scientists in the world at that time, was brought in to lead the physical evidence analysis. He and his team worked for weeks in freezing temperatures, sifting through debris along the riverbank and lakeside with the kind of methodical care that most people associate with archaeological digs rather than crime scenes. What they assembled was a case built on fragments. Each individual piece was, on its own, arguable, but collectively, the evidence told a story that was increasingly difficult to dispute. The chainsaw found in the Crafts' home bore biological material consistent with a human being. The rented woodchipper, which Richard had kept for longer than the rental agreement specified, and which had been used in conditions no legitimate landscaping job would require, showed similar trace evidence. And then there was the witness who had seen the truck near the river at around 3 a.m. on a night when the temperature had fallen well below freezing. A neighbor who, half asleep, had looked out a window and wondered, briefly, what someone was doing out there at that hour. That brief wondering would matter enormously. The investigation also revealed a pattern of behavior in the days and weeks surrounding Helly's disappearance that investigators found deeply significant. Richard had taken out a large life insurance policy on Helly earlier that year. He had obtained certain equipment, including the woodchipper and a freezer, in the period immediately before and after her disappearance. He had arranged for people to be around the children, creating a kind of alibi of normalcy. Everything had been planned. That is perhaps the most deeply unsettling thread running through the investigation. This was not a crime of passion, committed in a moment of uncontrolled emotion. The evidence suggested a methodical, extended process. A man who had thought carefully about how to make someone disappear, and who believed, with what we can only describe as staggering arrogance, that he had thought of everything. He had not thought of Dr. Henry Lee. He had not thought of Karen Rogers. And he had not thought of the strand of blonde hair that survived the river and the cold and found its way into the hands of people who would not let it go. Richard Crafts was arrested in January 1987. His trial began in 1988. The first trial ended in a hung jury. One juror could not be convinced. The state of Connecticut retried him, and in 1989, Richard Crafts was found guilty of the murder of his wife, Hella Crafts. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. When we try to understand cases like this one, and it is worth trying, not to excuse but to comprehend, we are often drawn toward the dramatic, the explosive anger, the visible signs of danger. But Richard Crafts presents a more uncomfortable profile. He was not visibly unstable. He was not known to his community as a threatening man. He was a pilot, a profession that requires emotional regulation, technical precision, and the ability to perform under pressure. He was a part-time police officer in his town. He was a neighbor, a colleague. What forensic psychology tells us about men who commit crimes like this is that the outward stability is often not a mask. It is a genuine part of who they are. The compartmentalization is real. The ability to move between roles, to be the disciplined professional in one context and the controlling intimate partner in another, is not performance. It is a deeply embedded way of moving through the world. Control is the common thread. People who knew the Crafts marriage describe Richard as someone who managed people, situations, outcomes. The affairs were not just about desire. They were about the maintenance of a self-image that depended on having options, on never being constrained. The idea of divorce, of Hella taking control of her own life and potentially disrupting his financial stability and public image, may have represented to him a loss of control he found intolerable. There is also what psychologists sometimes call the grandiosity of the detailed plan. When someone plans something this elaborate, the equipment, the timing, the disposal, the cover story, it reflects not just cold calculation, but a certain confidence. An internal monologue that says, "I am smarter than the people who will look for her. I have considered every angle. I will not be caught." That confidence, paradoxically, is often what undoes people like Richard Crafts. The conviction that they have outsmarted the system leads them to make assumptions, that rivers wash away everything, that cold destroys evidence, that a community will accept a wife's disappearance without question. Each of those assumptions was wrong. What is worth sitting with in the psychological portrait of this case is what it tells us about the lives of women in marriages where power is imbalanced in invisible ways. Hella's friends knew something was wrong for years. She knew it herself. The decision to leave, to consult an attorney, to hire a private investigator, was an act of genuine courage. And yet the window between that courage and safety was smaller than it should have been. This is not a case study in obvious danger signs. It is a case study in the danger of underestimating quiet control, in the risk that exists in the space between deciding to leave and actually being safe. The Crafts case left marks on the American legal and forensic landscape that are still visible today. First, and most significantly, it established, for the first time in Connecticut history, that a murder conviction could be secured without the presence of a body. This was not a small thing. It became a landmark precedent, one that prosecutors and legal scholars have pointed to in the decades since as a foundational moment in how American law thinks about physical evidence. Before the Crafts case, the absence of a body was often considered an insurmountable obstacle. After it, the standard shifted. What matters is not the completeness of what remains, but the totality of what the evidence communicates. Second, the case transformed forensic science. Dr. Henry Lee's work, the painstaking collection and analysis of microscopic fragments, demonstrated what was possible when investigators refused to accept that a scene had nothing left to offer. The methods developed and refined during the Crafts investigation became part of the standard forensic curriculum. They influenced how evidence is collected, cataloged, and interpreted in thousands of cases that followed. Third, the case prompted serious conversations about how law enforcement responds to reports of missing adults, particularly women in troubled marriages. The early dismissal of Karen Rogers' concern is a part of the story that should not be glossed over. Hella's friends knew, they said something, and they were not heard quickly enough. That failure, institutional, systemic, became part of the conversation that eventually led to improved missing persons protocols, better training around domestic violence risk assessment, and a greater understanding of the danger that exists in the period when someone decides to leave a controlling relationship. Hella Crafts did not survive, but in the ways that cases sometimes do, her story created something, a precedent, a method, a reminder. She has been gone for nearly 4 decades. Her children grew up without her. They grew up knowing what happened, which is perhaps its own kind of ongoing wound. Richard Crafts was released from prison in 2020, in his 80s, after serving more than 30 years. He maintained for many years that he was not responsible for his wife's death. That is his prerogative. The jury disagreed. The law disagreed. And the evidence, assembled with such care from a frozen riverbank in January, disagreed most of all. Every case we cover on this channel asks something of us, not just our attention, but our reflection, our willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths about how people harm one another, how systems sometimes fail, and how the truth, even when buried, has a way of finding its way to the surface. Hella Crafts was not a headline to me as I sat with this case. She was a person who came from another country and made a home, who raised children in a language that was not her first, who felt the loneliness of a marriage that had curdled, and who found the courage to begin moving towards something better. She deserved to reach it. She did not. And the reason she did not is not a mystery or a twist or a puzzle to be solved. It is the straightforward consequence of one person deciding that another person's life was less important than his own comfort, his own image, his own control. That is the thing about cases like this. At their core, they are not complicated. The forensics are complicated. The legal history is complicated. But the human center of it is simple. Someone chose, and someone else paid the price. What we can do, all we can do, is remember. To say the name of the person who was lost. To understand what the warning signs looked like, not so that we can judge those who missed them, but so that we might see them more clearly in our own lives, in the lives of people we love. Hella Crafts, a woman who deserved more time. If this kind of thoughtful, human-centered analysis is what you come here for, if you believe that the people inside these cases deserve more than shock value and spectacle, then consider subscribing to Western Family. Every case we cover the same way, with care, with context, and with the belief that understanding matters. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case, and share this video with someone who appreciates the kind of true crime content that asks real questions.